Thank you, Dave and the team, for leading us into God's presence through song. The reason I did a drama was because the rest of our time is going to be a little bit more somber. It's a tough passage we are dealing with this morning, but I thought the words of that beautiful song, "Prone to Wander, Lord, I Feel It," kind of sums up the atmosphere of this passage that we've been thinking about this morning, where the brothers get embroiled in this wandering so far away from God. The story of Joseph is actually one I've known my whole life, because at the age of about 11, I was in primary 7. We did it as a school play, so the song and the soundtrack literally goes round and round my head most days, particularly now that we're doing it up the stairs in Sunday school as well. For whatever reason, the teachers cast me as Potiphar's wife, the one who seduces Joseph and tries to ruin his life. You can take from that what you will. There are no videos of it, by the way. But this week's focus is on the betrayal of Joseph by his brothers. And we're going to have to linger in this difficult passage before we can carry on into the rest of Joseph's journey and get to the good bits. And it's not a comfortable read. It's not a comfortable drama, although we made it lighthearted there. It's a hard read. This passage is where sin runs riot, and the consequences are so far-reaching. I have to admit, I got sucked into watching a program called The Traitors quite recently. It's a game show where a bunch of strangers live in a beautiful Scottish castle up north for about 3 weeks, with the aim to complete challenges along the way to win money. But each person is given a secret role of playing either a faithful or a traitor. And the role of the traitors is to get rid of the faithful players so that they can get the biggest share of the prize money at the end. And at the end of series 2, 2 players were left. One was a faithful, one was a traitor. But the traitor had completely convinced the other that he was a faithful. The traitor therefore won the whole prize fund, leaving the faithful who had put our trust in that guy with 0. Talk about betrayal. And when true identities were revealed, the look of devastation on the face of this faithful woman was a picture. She knew she'd been played and betrayed and had lost all the money. And that's just a game show. Apparently, they're still friends. But the reality of our actual lives is that betrayal is deeply hurtful. And it's something each of us will have already experienced or will at some point face in our lives. We might be the ones betrayed, or we might be the ones who betray. Because at the heart of our sinful natures lies betrayal of God and betrayal of others. Because betrayal is the opposite of the greatest commandment, to love God and to love others. And it comes in different forms, doesn't it? So today we're going to listen to the different voices we hear in this story of betrayal. We're going to listen to them. We're going to examine our own hearts as we allow God to put a finger on our motivations, our possible hurts, and our sin. We're going to get to explore where we're at, whether we're remaining faithful to God in our hearts and others, or whether we're allowing our hearts to be deceived and allowing unhelpful thoughts towards others perpetuate. We'll also look at what it looks like to be on the receiving end of betrayal. But in all this, we're also going to keep in mind that God sees where we're at. Our struggles, our wounds from having been betrayed, or the struggles we have being in the position that the brothers were in, struggling hugely with their sin. And in all of it, we're going to lean on the grace and the providence of God, who we can trust in all of it, just like Joseph and his brothers eventually do. So let's dive in. We're going to look firstly at the voice of the betrayers. So the first voice we actually hear in this passage is dear old Jacob, who is played by Jan. And while we can't exactly say he betrayed Joseph, he's certainly a voice in this betrayal story because he acted blindly and foolishly, especially in the way he managed the whole situation around his family. His voice was key in the brothers' betrayal of Joseph because his favoritism cost Joseph friendship with his brothers. You'd think he would have known better, considering Jacob himself knew what it felt like to not be the favorite, because it was his brother Esau who was the favorite of his dad Isaac. And that led to Jacob deceiving his dad Isaac into giving him the blessing instead of his brother. History is repeating itself. You would have thought Jacob would have seen it. But as the stage show sings it, and I won't sing, Jacob couldn't see the danger. He couldn't imagine any danger. He saw in Joseph all his dreams come true. And with that, Jacob sends Joseph out again to check on his brothers, with his coat the mark of superiority over his brothers and favor. Where are Jacob's eyes at the moment? Jacob's eyes aren't on God, are they? They're fixed on his grief over losing his favorite wife, Rachel. So he's misplaced his hope on the first son that she bore him. It's easy to do, though, isn't it? It's a reminder to us that grief can actually lead us to cling to the past at the cost of living well in the present. Jacob had effectively made Joseph into an idol. It challenges us to beware of making idols out of the people we love the most, because we really don't love them well when we do that. We need to always ask ourselves, where are our eyes fixed? Who are they fixed on? Who are our idols? Who are we putting before God in our lives? So Jacob tells us actually to beware of making idols. The next voices we hear in this story of betrayal are, of course, the brothers' voices. Joseph eventually finds them in the field having to ask the random stranger where they've gone. And then the brothers see him coming. And the sin they're carrying in their hearts ignites into a plan for violence. Here comes the dreamer, they say. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Here comes that dreamer, showing their contempt for both Joseph and his dreams, and contempt for God, because the dreams were in fact God-given, as we know. But the brothers weren't in a place to hear anything from God or from Joseph, because they had let their hearts become so consumed with jealousy and hatred to the point that they were now prepared to kill their own brother. Such was their partnering with the sin in their hearts. Guard your hearts. This story is a wake-up call to guard our hearts against sin, isn't it? To be really intentional about what thoughts we allow into our minds about others and what we allow to breed in them. To guard our hearts is also to guard our thoughts, because what thoughts we choose to chew over and ruminate on really matters. That's why Paul tells us to take every thought captive, because our thoughts have power to direct our hearts and our motivations, and then our subsequent actions. Guarding our hearts keeps us in step with and being faithful to God, rather than being sucked into the power of sin. Jealousy and envy are particularly powerful emotions, aren't they? And we know that they tear relationships apart. Where are we at with these powerful emotions today? Especially because we're in a culture that actively tells us to go and get what someone else has or to be more like them. Do we allow jealousy to sit there when we see that the grass is always greener, or seemingly always greener, in other people's lives? Do we allow resentment to build up when we feel less loved, or less included, or less valued? Do we allow these feelings to fester in our hearts? Or do we admit our weakness, take it to God for help, trusting that He is big enough to work that healing in our lives, that He is able to transform our woundedness or our lack, the hurt that we carry, and help us turn that jealousy and greed and envy into blessing on others? Remember that there's only one of you, uniquely made by God for God's purposes, with our talents, with our imperfections, but God made one of us. Let's not keep looking to the left and to the right to others. Let's look at who God has made us and what He has for us. But when we think back to the brothers, we could feel tempted to feel a bit sorry for them, couldn't we? Weren't they justified in their anger and jealousy and resentment and wanting to get rid of Joseph? They weren't as loved. The text tells us they were not as loved. We know that Jacob's done a poor job of parenting. But can we ever say that these circumstances justified or excused their behavior? Can we? They were so fixed on blaming Joseph for his dreams, they justified their hatred. Each one of them, we know, had absolute responsibility for guarding their hearts against the sin-filled thoughts, and they were completely responsible for their subsequent actions. No one made them attack Joseph. And we too need to take responsibility for our thoughts and for our actions. It's no one else's responsibility except ours. Our circumstances can't justify behavior that's harmful to others. What we allow into our minds and our hearts and the consequences of that are our responsibility. This is what we need to do if we're staying on a path of faithfulness with God. The picture will be on the screen, but I listened to a person called Dr. Gwen Adshead, who is a forensic psychiatrist who works in the rehabilitation of the UK's most violent offenders. She herself is a Christian. And she said that in her professional experience, the journey towards rehabilitation can only begin when someone has taken full responsibility for their actions and for what they've done. Even if there were mitigating circumstances like provocation, like the brothers had, adverse childhood experiences, like the brothers had, and mental illness even. Admitting that we've done something seriously wrong because of where our minds and our hearts were at, and taking responsibility from that can actually move us forward toward freedom, recovery, and rehabilitation. If the brothers had only recognized how ill their hearts had become and taken responsibility for that, they might not have been so ready to justify their actions towards their own brother. Taking responsibility over our thoughts and actions is the key to keeping healthy relationships and stopping us betray each other. We do hear a little bit of hope from the brothers, though, in Reuben's voice. We're told that he doesn't really want to kill Joseph, and he wants to actually get him back to his dad. Pretty noble. The brothers were a hefty gang. But notice that he doesn't actually stand up to his brothers fully. He doesn't call them out on their actions and declare that they're wrong. He just tells them instead to chuck Joseph down the well. It's kind of a half-hearted attempt, isn't it, to save him? Maybe, of course, he was afraid of the brothers because we know that they were whipped up into a frenzy of violence and hate, so they could have turned on him. We can only speculate. But his actions don't save Joseph. His voice didn't stop the betrayal, did it? And it made me think about how hard it is for a lone voice to go against the crowd. It's sometimes easier to pretend to go along with what the rest of the crowd is doing rather than risk a backlash or rejection. When we did the Easter story with primary school children called the Easter Code, Jack Graham, our pastor friend from the Congregational Church, had this little game for the kids to play, and we all had to walk around in a circle. And then he got one of the 8 of us to turn in the opposite direction and try and go against the crowd. It's kind of carnage, a bit violent. And the girl that was made to go against the other 7 people going around was actually getting bashed and, slammed in the shoulders. But it was his way of saying, isn't it hard going against the crowd? It makes me think, this is why we did it Easter, of the crowds who welcomed Jesus to Jerusalem, shouting, Hosanna, God save us. But then a week later, the same crowds shouted, crucify him. I wonder if there was someone in that crowd that wanted to keep shouting, God save us, Hosanna, but were just too afraid. So they joined in with the crowd who said, crucify. When are we too afraid to stand up against the wrong that we see? We are called as God's people to be the voice that goes against the crowd, to in love speak God's truth to wrong and to evil. Reuben tears his clothes in anguish over not being able to save Joseph. He would have to live with the truth that he didn't do enough sooner to save his brother. Beware of the crowd when the crowd is moving against others. Proverbs 31, verses 8 to 10 says, speak out on behalf of the voiceless and for the rights of all who are vulnerable. If the crowd isn't doing this, then we have to stand out from that crowd. So back to the story, and the brothers sit and have a leisurely picnic right beside where they've thrown Joseph down the well. And then to seal Joseph's fate, Judah's voice enters the scene. Judah isn't content with just leaving Joseph for dead, but wants to make money out of it. Why not? He wants to make money out of this betrayal. So he spots an opportunity as the Ishmaelites, technically their cousins, come down. And he thinks 20 shekels will do nicely, thanks. And that concludes the voices of the betrayers. The voices of the betrayers warn us to guard our hearts, to take responsibility for our thoughts and our actions, and to watch that we don't just become part of the crowd and neglect speaking up for the voiceless. So what about the voice of the betrayed? What about Joseph's voice? The voice of the victim, the one who's been so dreadfully betrayed. Remember, he's betrayed by his very own family, the ones who are supposed to have his back, the ones whose blood bond should mean protection and care and love. But where is his voice in this part of the story? We haven't heard his voice since we heard him taking instructions from Jacob and saying, yes, Dad, I'll do that. His voice is unheard. It's strange, isn't it, that we don't hear him speak in this part of the story when everything being done is done directly to him and directly against him. Look at the contrast from Joseph's dreams in the previous verses, which was all about him telling everybody that he was going to be exalted over his brothers. And now he's literally below his brothers in the pit. Well, here's what I thought this week. I think Joseph's voice is deliberately absent from the text. The writers have left his voice out. Because I think it's actually a way of showing us just how unheard victims so often are because their perpetrators' hearts are so hardened. It shows that the brothers have become completely deaf and indifferent to Joseph's plight, deaf to his suffering, deaf to his fear, deaf to his fate. Do you think Joseph just went silently and took it all from his brothers after being so vocal up to this point? Well, no, and the Bible tells us he wasn't. Because later in Genesis chapter 42, when the brothers are beginning their journey of repentance, because famine has come across the land, they say this in verse 21. They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us." The brothers heard Joseph's cry, but they chose not to hear them. And for us today, we need to acknowledge that sin can make us deaf to the needs of others. If we've allowed hate or jealousy or greed to rule our hearts, then we become at best indifferent and cold towards the needs of others. And at worst, we are directly involved in their suffering and betrayal because we dismiss their cries for help. And I get that as we sit here today, this kind of drama and the level of hatred we encounter in this passage might thankfully feel not very possible for us right now. But if you think about it, every atrocity committed against someone else began with a thought about them, and then a heart attitude towards them, which can then lead to a hatred and an indifference to their cries for help and to their humanity. You don't have to look very far in history or even right now to our news feeds, how easily propaganda can affect how we think about someone else. We cannot let ourselves become deaf to one another and deaf to those who are suffering and become complicit in their suffering. Joseph's voice isn't heard in this part of the story, and that should be a warning to each of us. Perhaps, though, this morning, you actually identify with Joseph. Perhaps, like Joseph, you seem to have no voice. Are you still in shock at the betrayal by someone close to you that was supposed to love you and supposed to honor you? Do you feel, or have you felt at a time in the past, you've been crying out in the dark, and it feels like no one is listening or no one is choosing to hear you? We know that betrayal can leave deep scars and make it so difficult to trust people again or have any sense that your experience has been validated, been seen, and been heard. But we know in the story of Joseph that Joseph was seen and was heard by God, because we have a God who knows firsthand about betrayal. Jesus knows betrayal. Jesus heard the crowds shouting, "Hosanna," and then a week later, "Crucify him." And even more than this, he received a kiss of betrayal from one of his closest friends, Judas, and then was abandoned and disowned one by the rest of his closest of friends at the point where he needed them most. The very people he came to save betrayed him, the maker of heaven and earth. But sin didn't win, did it? Despite the sin and betrayal of the people that took Jesus to death, God's plan, providence, and purposes were greater than the sin of those who wanted God defeated. The biggest betrayal of all time, the betrayal of the Son of God, was turned into the greatest victory over sin, betrayal, and death. The cross became a symbol of victory, not of death. It leads us to this sort of precipice of the great mystery of God's providence and human freedom, his care for us, his working through our lives, and our free choice to choose whether we work with him or not. When we look at Joseph's betrayal, we need to sneak a peek at the end result of Joseph's story to hear Joseph's voice. Because we hear him proclaim that despite the betrayal, God's purposes won out. Joseph says to his brothers in Genesis 50, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." Sin didn't win. God turned Joseph's betrayal into the beginning of Joseph's journey that would lead him to save his family and the whole nation of Israel. All Joseph had to go on was God's voice in the dreams that he'd been given. In the midst of the betrayal, Joseph must have held tight to God's voice. Hence why when he looked back, he knew that God had been with him and had never left him. Knowing that God has been before us through betrayal and is with us in the midst of our stories of betrayal gives us hope for every circumstance that we face. In the midst of our sin, the sin done against us, and the midst of the dire and impossible circumstances, it's God's plan and purposes for good that will prevail, because he alone is able to bring it about. Tim Mackey from the Bible Project says this about this chapter of Joseph. This narrative focuses on moments in our lives when we can't see how God could be active in our stories. And it shows us that there is not a moment of our lives, not a moment, that isn't somehow woven into God's plan. There isn't a moment of your life, there isn't a moment of my life that isn't heard and seen by God and woven into God's plan for good. We've looked today at this difficult passage of the voices in betrayal in the story of Joseph. Those who were the betrayers, those who were betrayed. And we can learn so much about our hearts and our responsibilities before God and remaining faithful to him. But most of all, take encouragement from the fact that God in his grace is working in all our circumstances today as he always has been. He is constantly active in our stories. Sin doesn't and won't win, because our God has shown us that even in the worst of betrayals shown to us in this story this morning, and in Jesus being taken to death on the cross, that he is able to transform all sin and all our circumstances into victory. Wherever you find yourself this morning, take comfort from the fact that God is with us, God is working, and God is able. As we finish this morning, I'm just going to ask the team to come, and we're going to sing a song, God is Able, as a way for us to proclaim who God is in our lives. But let me just pray as they come before we sing. God, thank you for the beauty and the challenge of your word, for the stories of families thousands of years ago who can show us how much we need you. If there are things that you need to work on in our hearts, we surrender ourselves to you this morning. Help us to be faithful to you and to others. Help us to remember that because you were betrayed, the sting of betrayal in our lives has less power. Convict us in our sin, comfort us in our brokenness, and help us proclaim that you are the God who is able to bring about good in impossible circumstances. We proclaim this morning that you are our God. We follow you, we love you, and you are able. Amen.